Rafael Mangual, our friend over at Manhattan Institute, focuses on crime, has done a great public service. He's provided a handy template where you just have to fill in the names. And Amy, you should get this over to your friends in the Chicago Press Corps. This is perfect for all the big blue city mayors and their comm shops, which is the local press corps. And it's no different in New York versus Chicago versus L.A. versus San Francisco versus Portland versus Seattle versus Baltimore versus Memphis. So, New Orleans, I go on. So everybody just, keep it simple. Let's standardize it. Because they're just blithely presiding over the degradation and death in those cities anyway. So let's, this is better than AI, ChatGPT. I'll give you a couple of examples, just a riff from it. I tweeted it out if you want to read it. It's really good. Every crime report. Insert city, police have made an arrest in connection with the deadly shooting that killed one and wounded another earlier this week outside insert address in insert neighborhood. Insert defendant name and age is charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder in addition to weapons offenses. Insert defendant name appeared in court this morning where he pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors allege that insert defendant's name was targeting rival gang members outside a house party just before midnight. Families of the deceased, insert deceased victim's name, said that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah. He wasn't involved in any of the gang stuff, said a tearful insert name, insert deceased names, deceased victim's name's mother. He just came to the party with his girlfriend. I guess some of the people outside were the target, said the mother of another party attendee who asked not to be named. This is not the first time something like this has happened around here, she continued, citing similar shootings last summer outside a graduation party and a barbecue in insert neighborhood. Police say that deceased victim's name, insert, girlfriend, insert surviving victim's name, was also wounded in the shooting. Paramedics rushed surviving victim's name to insert hospital name, where she underwent emergency surgery and remains in critical condition.
Oh, my gosh.
Insert defendant name has 11 prior arrests and was placed on probation last year following a conviction for drugs. At this morning's arraignment, prosecutors asked Judge insert name to deny bail, citing defendant's name, extensive criminal history, which includes charges for weapons possession, felony assault, and robbery, as well as cell phone records placing defendant name in the vicinity of the shooting, which is more than 10 miles from his home. So on, blah, 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 blah. You can go on and go on with this. There's a couple more paragraphs, but doesn't that sound like every story that you read in CWB Chicago, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times?
Yeah.
You read about
verbatim.
You read about 800 of these stories a year. Mm-hmm. And what's the response? Double down. Triple down. Silly kids. Kids that make silly decisions. Those are the words of BLM Brandon, our newly minted mayor. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Jukka Savolainen. I hope I got that right or close. Former director of the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data, professor of sociology and criminology at Wayne State University, and a writing fellow at Heterodox Academy. Jukka, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
You wrote recently about Chicago's criminal irresponsibility, and we're sort of lampooning that with a little help from our friend Rafael Mangual at the Manhattan Institute. What you saw at the weekend that we've talked a lot about back in April, where Brandon Johnson saw kids being silly, making silly decisions.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, there was a lot of coverage of that. I think there was a pretty universal condemnation of his naive remarks about these issues. Not a very great start for his now started mayoral tenure. My point was really to show that as strange and ineffective as his response was, it is actually a reflection of a dominant trend at the sort of federal policy and, shall we say, academic circles, this idea of being very understanding and supportive of the offender's situation, often at the expense of the victims, who are actually most typically come from the same population, same neighborhoods, and same demographics.
But you also wrote a piece recently. To some extent, the answer is obvious, but the details are important. By the way, the media's reporting, since we're lampooning the media's reporting, is always black and white. It's either just the straight body count, or if it's black and white, then it's sensationalized. It could be in a New York subway. It could be at a bike stand outside of a hospital. It could be anywhere. But there are other kinds of people with different ethnic makeups in this country, different races and ethnicities. They matter too, and they don't get that much coverage. Why?
Yeah. Why is of course a big question. But I did a small study that. I'm like most of us. We follow news. You listen to the NPR. You read the New York Times, and a lot of these mainstream outlets. And what you typically, what struck me was that there's always this contrast between blacks and whites. Okay. That we talk about racial disparities, whether it's in criminal justice outcomes, whether it's about incarceration or violence, or any other like health issues, health disparities, and so on. I'm an immigrant myself. I come from Finland, and I consider United States as a very multicultural society. We have people of all kinds of races and ethnicities and interracial relationships and all that. So I find it strange that contemporary media, mainstream outlets, reduce these issues into black and white, literally. And so I looked into that, and sure enough, when you look at the data, 80% of the stories are exactly as described, which means that for the most part, most stories that you hear or read about racial disparities ignore Native Americans, ignore Asians, ignore Hispanics, and so on. And I found that's pretty misleading for the general public.
Well, there was a good example of this. There was a Stop Asian Hate campaign in New York when Asian people of Asian extraction were getting beaten up or worse on the streets of New York. Stop Asian Hate. Asians are being targeted. But that campaign went away. Stop getting publicity when people started getting arrested for attacking these Asian Americans, and they were black. Yep. Maybe it has something to do with the media not wanting to just tell a story where it's minority group and minority group. It's always got to be minority group versus the honkies, the latent white supremacists that owe reparations and so forth. Could that be part of it?
Yeah. Well, I believe so. In that piece that I wrote, my explanation was that if you want to push this narrative of U.S. as a white supremacist nation, then it makes entire sense to reduce these issues into, again, black and white, and talk about whites versus others, or whites versus blacks. And like I said, that type of comparison, that type of perspective, that type of framing dominates the news coverage. So yeah, that's entirely true. And when it comes to Asian hate crime, you're also correct about it, that it's probably this inconvenient truth that much of it, and hate crime is a problematic concept. It's hard to measure hate, per se. So I would not trust the statistics on hate crime per se. That's a different conversation. But if you just look at the interracial crime and interracial violence, they look at who victimizes Asian Americans. Sad reality is they tend to be predominantly black folks, and I think it has a lot to do with the opportunity. Asians, a lot of large Asian populations in urban centers, and there are a lot of African Americans, and there's a more of an overlap there in terms of just proximity. But that's reality. However, in the media, oftentimes you get more attention on things like, if you recall, the Atlanta shooting of those massage parlors, which probably wasn't even a hate crime. That got a ton of attention. This evangelical, I forget, religious, a Christian white man went to a shooting spree. That was all over the news. Probably wasn't even a hate crime against Asian Americans. From what I could, there were other victims as well, but you don't get so much coverage about these much more common incidents of Asian Americans beaten up in inner cities.
What about these teenage takeovers? You wrote an article about Chicago's criminal irresponsibility, about the teenage takeovers that happened in April. One, a Friday night at the beach, and then the next day they were all called down to the, what's wrong? they're all called down to Michigan Avenue in downtown. Do you think social media is to blame for all this, or it's fueling it?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's the new MO. I don't know if you, I mean, I don't live in even in Illinois, but I just saw that something similar happened in a fair in that, I forget the name of the town, escapes me,
Tinley
but
Park.
it's right off of,
Yeah.
exactly, right off of I-90, I suppose, And so that's, as far as I understand, far out from Chicago, but in the same sort of broader metro area, and that had the same type of MO, right? People were following social media, and there was some sort of call for sort of flash mob, which I think is a kind name for that type of, violent, planned violent altercation. So yeah, that's clearly, and I'm pretty sure the police are pretty aware of it. It's hard to address these, but yeah, this is the new normal.
Kids making silly decisions, as the mayor says. What about things like this? Because we see a lot of these sort of alternative sentencing programs from these non-prosecution decarceration politicians, both prosecutors, mayors. This is from Adams in New York, Eric Adams, to deal with shoplifting, diversion programs to allow nonviolent offenders to avoid prosecution or incarceration by meaningfully engaging with services to help address underlying factors that lead to shoplifting. Got to get to the root causes. So he's going to install resource kiosks in stores to connect individuals in need to critical government resources and social services, and train, and also an employee support program to train retail workers in de-escalation tactics. Wonderful. So the shoplifter who's stealing food or whatever else, he's just in need of if there was just a kiosk where he could access some government programs, then that would quell shoplifting. Does that make sense, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no. The longer answer is that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. There's a long history of research on various diversion programs and what works in preventing crime and such, and the track record for those type of experiments is not strong. In other words, they don't seem to work. I'm all in favor, for what it's worth, of improving life opportunities and circumstances of disadvantaged folks. The sad reality is, though, that shoplifters. One thing we know about crime and from criminological research is that there's very little specialization in criminal activity. What I mean by that is that shoplifters are not just shoplifters. Fare beaters in New York City are not just people who refuse to pay for a subway. Crime is very sort of general characteristic that violent offenders tend to be shoplifters and vice versa. So this idea that if you have a chronic shoplifter, that we're just focusing on nonviolent offender tends to be a myth, because we often find that they all hang together. Number one, but I would reemphasize what I said earlier, is that it's the most people in poor areas, minority communities, are not criminal. And they are the ones, you made a reference to Rafael Mangual, and he has an excellent book called Criminal Injustice. And one of the main points of that book is that these policies that you refer to, these progressive prosecutors, as they are called, the consequences of these policies is most harmful for people who live in these communities that suffer extraordinary levels of violence and victimization. So that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, exactly. I'm right. That's an important point. My game's just shoplifting. No, that's not how it works. And by the way, I mean, in terms of like, I know there's a lot of sort of one-off and dumb criminals that are just sort of generally lawless and have no impulse control. And then there are also operations that are sophisticated. I mean, there was an arrest made last week in New York, 2 guys running a theft ring the catalytic converters. We've talked a lot about that on this show. Chicago, everybody is stealing catalytic converters. Why? Why? Because these two guys in New York, these two young men in New York, put together a $170 million business on stolen catalytic converters, trafficking in stolen catalytic converters. So these are two young people that should, be on a track to be a CEO somewhere. But all of the institutions that politicians talk about all the time don't seem to be able to get to the those that are menaces to society because, menaces to society and don't have much upside based on their conduct, and those that are menaces to society but have maybe huge upside, but institutions fail them.
Right. Yeah. No, like I said, I'm entirely in favor of encouraging, your current mayor, Brandon Johnson, talks about summer jobs and those type of initiatives. I'm entirely in favor of that. And there's actually good evidence for those type of programs helping. Is evidence from Chicago in particular, helping folks in the long run. But it's not one or the other. I guess the analogy that I would use is that you don't want to be fixing the house while the roof is burning. You have to first take care of the fire. There's some urgent issues.
Exactly.
So if you have a situation in Chicago where folks are leaving, the decent folks are escaping, are not going out, and this is all affecting. We have good evidence of this too. Living in this type of violent, chaotic environment harms educational outcomes of folks in these areas, kids in these areas and families, and little by little businesses and decent folk move out, which pretty much happened in the city where I teach, which is Detroit, Michigan, a long time ago. So the concern that I have is the Chicago, a city that I love, is on track to something similar.
He is Jukka Savolainen, a former director of the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data, professor of sociology and criminology at Wayne State University, he was just mentioning, and a writing fellow at Heterodox Academy. Jukka, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.